Hi guys, welcome to Phoenix Tutorial Part 3. My name is Tensor from the Tensor Programming blog. So today we're going to finish our authorization model for our chat application. To do this, we are going to make use of two different modules. One is called Come On In, and it allows us to hash our passwords. And the other one is Guardian, which allows us to generate JWTs, which stands for JSON Web Token. Alright, so let's get started. So first we want to add come in to our dependencies. So first we put it inside of our dependency, which is inside of our mix.exs file. And then we also put it up here in our application. If you're on Windows, you are going to need to open up a developer command prompt so that you have access to your C++ and C compilation files to compile come on in. So inside of this developer command prompt, we want to run mix do deps get comma compile, and this will get the dependency as well as compile it. Now if you look at the code that gets run here after come on in, you can see that make gets run, and obviously it builds a bunch of C files. Afterwards, we have our chatter app, which is generated. So we can close out of this developer console now. Now, if we open up our REPL as well as our server, we can come in here and we can run common.pbkdf2.hashpassword and then put in a string. In this case, I put in password, and this will actually generate a fully encrypted password. So as you can see here, here's the encryption string. It's pretty damn long. The other option with common is to use bcrypt library, which for me currently I'm having issues getting it to run on this Windows machine. But if you're using Mac or you're using Linux, it's a viable alternative to the pbkdf2 format. To encrypt our password, we want to create a new change set function. This change set will be run and it will validate our password specifically. More specifically, first we will cast our password to make sure it's a string, and then we will validate the length of our password to make sure it is only at least of length 5. And then we will run this hash password function, which we'll create here in a moment. And this function will basically take our structure, strip out the password, then encrypt it, and then put it into the encrypt pass field up here, and then put it into the database. Alright, so here's our hash password function, and as you can see in here, we run a bunch of pattern matching against our change set, and then we check to see if our change set is valid, and then we make changes to password. If we have a valid change set, then we put change, and specifically we put change on our change set, and then we call come on in to hash the password, and then we assign it to encrypt path. If we have an invalid change set, then we just return the change set with this function. Alright, so now we want to go into our user controller and we want to change specifically our create function and our update function. And if you look at our create function, we use this user.changeSet function to create our change set. But we want to change the function from changeSet to reg changeSet so that it will validate both the email and the password, as well as hash the password and then put it into the database. And we'll do the same for update. So we just go down here and we type in reg changeSet instead. Now we can check to see if this works by creating a new user here. Let's create a user called tensor@test.com, and we'll give it a password. Now if we view the data, as in all of the users that have been inputted into our database, we can see here that we have the hashed password in here. If you look at the other users in here, these ones have clean database passwords. Now we can update these user passwords if we want, so that they will be hashed as well, and I think we should do that. So first we'll edit our test@test.com, and then we'll edit metal@test.com. Now if we just update our data, you can see here that we have 3 hashed passwords. Each of them are different, even though all the passwords are password. Okay, so now that we're able to hash passwords and put them into the database with our user email, we now want to be able to actually go ahead and create our login and logout functionality. So for this, we're going to use a module called Guardian. Now, Guardian is sort of like Warden. If any of you guys have ever used Ruby on Rails, Warden is very similar to Guardian. Guardian is sort of a reimagined version of Warden, wherein Elixir manages the authentication requirements. It's a functional system and it integrates with Plug, though it can be used outside of Plug if you want to. The core of Guardian is, of course, JSON Web Tokens, as I mentioned before, and you can use JWTs to authenticate web endpoints, channels, and TCP sockets. It can also contain authenticated assertions that the user wants to include. Alright, so let's add Guardian to our dependencies. So we just put Guardian underneath come on in right here. And Guardian, this version is 0.14. Now there's a little bit more boilerplate that comes with Guardian. We do not need to add an atom for it up in our application here. However, we do need to add something to our config.exs file. Alright, so here's the block that we need to add. As you can see, we have a config, calls out to Guardian, then we specify the algorithm, and this is just basically boilerplate that we've just taken directly from the Guardian GitHub. And I want to change this my app to chatter, and then we do not have a secret key, so we're just going to put an empty string in here for now. And then our serializer is going to be chatter at Guardian serializer, and this is something that we will create here in a moment. Now we need to restart our server and we need to get the dependencies. Alright, so after everything's been compiled, we can run mix phoenix.gen.secret, and this will generate our secret key. So this big string here, just copy it out of your command prompt or your terminal, and then you want to paste it into this field where it says secret key. And this is basically the string that you're using to authenticate all your JSON tokens. So this is something that you want to keep private if you're trying to deploy this application out into the public. But for now, we're just going to hard code it in here. The next thing we want to do before we spin up the server is we want to create our Guardian serializer. We're going to put this in the controllers folder, and we'll just name it Guardian serializer.ex. And all of this here is basically just a bunch of boilerplate again that we took off of the Guardian website. Make sure that you spell serializer correctly. Next, we want to go into our router.ex, and we want to add to our browser pipeline. We want to add these two plugs to our pipeline here, and then we want to create an entirely new pipeline. And our new pipeline will be called browser auth. And this will have verify session, which is also what we have up here. And then it will have this ensure authenticated, which will point to a handler that we have to create here in a moment. And then we'll also have the load resource here. Now we can just save everything in here, and let's create our token file. And again, our token file will also go into our controllers folder. So our token file just needs two functions in it at minimum, and these two are unauthenticated and unauthorized, both of which will take the connection, put a flash on it, and then redirect back to a session path. Now we haven't created our session path yet because we haven't created our session controller, but for now we're just going to leave this like this, and our session path new path will actually be our login page. So that's the current idea here. So basically these run every single time somebody makes a request from our server. One of these will run if a JWT has not been authorized to that user, and then if they do run, they will redirect the user back to the login page. Alright, so now that we go back into our router.ex file, we want to do a few things. So first we want to specify which resources we want to be unprotected. If we leave users unprotected, we can make it so that anybody can log in and create a new user and access our create file. So then we'll also have our sessions here unprotected, and we'll have our sessions controller pointing to only create and delete. So this will make it so that a person can log in and log out. These here, this second scope block, will be using our browser authentication, so our handler token here, as well as the browser. So it will use this pipeline and this pipeline, and it will specifically point to these functions, so show, index, and update. So a user needs to be logged in to see their show, see the index, and be able to update their password or email address. And they also need to be logged in to actually see our chat. So we've moved our chat from the root route to a chat route, and we're now going to create a session controller on the root route instead. That way we have our login when somebody comes into our root route. So now let's create our session controller. This is going to be in our controllers folder again. Now for our sessions controller, we want to use chatter.web and make it a controller, and then we want to define a new function. So this just takes in the connection and renders new.html, which we're going to create here in a moment. So we go into our templates and we create a new folder called session, and inside of it we're going to create a new.html.eex file. And here is our new.html.eex file. As you can see, we have an H1 at the top, then we have some embedded Elixir that says form for connection, and then we point specifically to the session path of create, and we specify that this is as a session. and then we run this anonymous function f. And then we have two divs here, or rather three divs, but two main divs here. One of them has the label for email as well as the input or email input, and then an error tag for email as well. And then the next one has label for password, then the password input, and then of course the error tag for password. And then finally we have a button submit at the bottom, and this is basically just our login form. Alright, so now let's spin up our actual server. And of course we get an error because we haven't created our session view yet. So for each controller you want to make sure to make a view if you're going to have some HTML. So let's create a file inside of our views folder called sessionview.ex. And then we'll just specify that this is a view. Then if we actually open up our server, you can see here that now we have a sign-in page. Now of course this sign-in page has no functionality yet, but we're going to get to that in a moment. So let's jump back into our session controller and let's create our create function. Alright, so here is our create function. As you can see here, we get the session and then we pick it apart. We assign the email to a user variable, and then we assign our password to our password variable. Then we call a function called login, in which case we send the connection, the user, which is the email, and the password, as well as our repository, so we specify our database. And then if we get a response from this function that says OK and the connection, then we assign logged user to guardian.plug.currentResource, which is the actual person who logged in. Then we send the connection, we put a flash on it that says logged in, and then we redirect to page path, which is our chat application, and the index. If we get back an error, however, we will get back the reason, which we don't need, and we'll get back the connection. We'll take the connection, we'll put the flash with an error saying wrong username, password, and then we will re-render new.html again, so the login screen. So now we need to create this login with function. So let's create a new file. The file will be called auth.ex, so auth.ex. So inside our chatter.auth file, we need to import come on in. And we only need to import check password and dummy password. Now check password allows us to check a plain scoped password with the already encrypted password. So we can check the password that's being sent into the login form with a password that is already in our database. Next we will create a private function called login. This will take in our connection and our user, and all it will do is send our connection to guardian.plug sign in user, and it will give that user access. Now we create our login with function, and in this we're taking in the connection, the email, the password, as well as some options, which is our repository. Then we're going to get our repo, so we're going to use this keyword fetch function to get our repository. Now this is something that comes with Phoenix. It allows us to easily grab a repository that may be scoped to a different model. Then we need to get the user, so we're going to say repo.getBy, and then we're going to pass in the model, and we want it by email, so specifically we want the email. Then we're going to run a conditional. The first condition is if user and check password, as in like our come on in, check password comes back as OK, then we log in the user. If we just get a user back and the password check doesn't work, then we throw an error and we run the unauthorized function that we have inside of our serializer, and we use our connection. And finally, if we get true back, then we just run this dummy check password, and then we put an error and we call our not found function, and then we send the connection back. Alright, so now let's go back into our session controller and import our authentication, and now we should be able to actually log in. So say we put in the wrong password. I'm just going to put in some gobbledygook. As you can see, our unauthenticated function runs and we get back this wrong username and password. But if we put in the correct password, it actually will authenticate and it will send us to our chat. So let's add a few cool little features to this. So now we need to add a logout function to our application. So our logout is pretty simple. We're just going to call it delete. We put in the connection and then the params, which we're not going to use, so we make that an anonymous variable. And then we just say pipe the connection into guardian.plug.signout, and then we redirect to our login page, which is just our root route. So this will sign out the user and get rid of their JWT. Now we want to actually go to our templates layout folder. and create a new file. This file will be called logged.html.ex, and this is going to allow us to have our login, logout button. So based on the state of the user, we will be able to know whether or not we should display a login button or a logout button. So this little piece of HTML just says if logged in, and this is something that we need to create here in a moment, this function, and we send in the connection. Then we create our link for sign out, which points to our delete function, and it gives our user access, so it checks that the user has access. And of course we point to the method of request delete, and then we make the button red. Underneath of it we will have our current user, so the user name of the person who signed in, and we'll specifically be showing their email. And if the user clicks on this, then it will send them to their profile. Otherwise, if the user is not logged in, then we will have a button that says create account, and it'll point to our user path of new, and we will have a sign in button as well, which will point to our session path of new. So the user will be able to either A, create an account, or B, just log in. So now we want to go inside of our app.html.ex, and we want to render this here where we have this link to our to the Phoenix framework. So all we have to do is put some embedded Elixir here, and we say render. More specifically, we're rendering this HTML, log.html, and then we are specifying the connection, so at con. So this is not actually going to work. So if we open up our server and we go to say the root route, we're just going to get an error, and that's because we haven't created the function logged in. So we need to create the function as a helper function for our view. So let's create a new file inside of our views folder. File will be called helper.ex, and this will house our helper functions. And we'll just call the module view helper, and we'll have two functions. The current user function, which allows us to get the current resource, aka the user that's logged in. And then we have a function that will allow us to check to see if a user has been authenticated or not. So now to actually allow our views access to these functions, we need to go into our web.ex file, come down here to our def view function, and go below here and just import our helper file. As you can see here, we just import chatter.viewHelper. So now if we reload our application, you can see here we now have the name of the person who signed in. I'm currently signed in as metal.test, and we also have a sign out button. And if I click metal@test, it will go to the profile. I can hit back and it will go to the list of users. And I can still go to the profiles of everybody else because everything's still sort of working. We can sign out though. Now that we can log in and we can say go to chat, as you can see, it still doesn't show the person who's logged in, so let's edit our chat HTML to make it show the person. If we go to page index.html, if you remember how our chat works, we use a basically jQuery to get the inner HTML right here of our span, and that's how we define the user that's been logged in. So if we replace the embedded Elixir with this current user function, we pass in the connection and then we specify .email, now it should work. So as you can see here, now it's saying that test@test.com has logged in, and that's the person I'm actually logged in at. Now, one problem that we still have is that as test@test.com, I can edit metal@test.com, and I can go to the profile, and I can also delete the user. So let's fix all of this. So now we want to go to our user controller, and what we want to do is we want to add a conditional to each of the pieces that we want to hide. Alright, so to make it so that our user, if we log in, we can't access certain things, we need to specify that we are a specific user. So if we look at our show function used to just get the user out of the database and then render the show HTML file. But now we put this conditional in where we check to see if the user is equal to the current resource, so guardian.plug.currentResource, and if it is, then we render show.html. Otherwise, if we get an error, then we put a flash that says no access, and we redirect back to the user path of connection index. So to see an example of this, we're currently logged in as test@test.com, but now we made it so that we can't see metal@test.com's profile. So if I click profile here, it'll come back and say no access. So we want to add the same kind of concept to our edit function. So as you can see here, we put this conditional in, whereas before it just was getting the user by ID out of the repository. Then it was running the user through the change set and then rendering the HTML with the user and the change set. Now we're using a conditional to check if the user is in fact the user who is trying to edit this profile, and if they are, then they are able to, and if not, then we just write no access. So now if we come back to our server and we click edit user for metal@test, it'll come back and say no access. We want to add the conditional to our update function as well. So our update function gets the user out of the repository, runs the user through our reg change set function. Then we want to check the conditional to see if the user is, in fact, the user who's trying to access the update function. Then we run a case for the repo. And if the case works, then all of this will work. If not, we get the error back and we re-render edit.html. And then we have our error at the end of our conditional where we send the connection, we put the flash on, and then we send the user back to the user path index. Finally, we want to do it for our delete function as well. So as you can see here, we've changed our delete function. So before it was just user, get the user out of the repository, then delete the user, then send the connection through the flash, and redirect back to user path index. We check to see if the user is in fact the user, then we delete the user, then we redirect. This time, however, we do not want to redirect to user path because it wouldn't make sense. If we delete the user, then we shouldn't be still logged in as the user. We want to redirect back to session path. That way, if we delete the user, it will log us out and automatically put us at the login form. We also want to specifically put guardian.plug.signout so that it will get rid of the JWT. That way a person won't be able to delete their own account and then somehow still have access. So now if I go and try and delete metal at test, it won't work. So you can do this for literally any part of the application. If you want to continue to add restrictions to different parts of the application, maybe you just want the admin to have access to this list of users, we could easily do that. Finally, we just want to add a link to chat inside of our show user, so the user profile. So we're just putting link chat, so the name chat, and we're putting the page path of index. And I put a class on it, even though it kind of looks ugly. And then I put 2 page breaks between it and the link to back. And if you look here, now we can just click the chat button and it'll go to the chat room. Alright, so now we can see that this chat application is working. Test@test.com is logged in, and then on this side I'm logged into metal@test.com. And if I type something in, it appears on both screens, as well as has a timestamp. Of course, we have no permanence for our messages, so if I reload this, the messages will disappear. And this is something that we will address in a later tutorial. Alright guys, well I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If you did, feel free to like and subscribe. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them in the comments section. And if you dislike it, then go ahead and bitch about it all you want. Alright guys, well have a good day.